To set up the game of Skip-Bo, first, set up the game. To do this, first remove any blank cards from the deck. These cards can be used as replacement cards if any of the other cards in the deck are damaged or missing. The remaining deck will contain 162 cards. One player will shuffle the deck of cards and deal cards to each player. In a 2 to 4 player game, deal 30 cards to each player. In a 5 or 6 player game, deal 20 cards to each player. Each player will place their cards, known as their stockpile, face down in front of them. Next, each player will flip over the top card of their stockpile and place it face up on top of the other cards in their stockpile. Each player should have enough space in their player area to be able to place 4 additional piles of cards in front of them as the game goes on. Place the remaining deck cards in the middle of the playing area to create the draw pile. Make sure there is space to put 4 additional piles of cards, known as building piles, next to the draw pile. After setting up each player's area and the game area, players are ready to begin playing the game. The game of Skip-Bo is a competitive card game where players are working to be the first player to get rid of all of the cards in their stockpile. The game of Skip-Bo plays out in turns. The youngest player will start the game, and play will continue in a clockwise direction. During each player's turn, they will complete the 3 steps of their turn. The first step of a player's turn is to draw the 5 hand cards. Players will draw their hand cards from the draw deck in the middle of the playing area. On the first turn of the game, players will not have any cards, so they will draw 5 cards. As the game goes on, you may have cards remaining in your hand from the previous turn. If this is the case, simply draw enough cards to get your hand up to 5 cards. If the deck runs out of cards while a player is drawing, shuffle the main discard pile that will be created, and create a new draw pile. After completing step 1 of their turn, the player will move on to step 2 of their turn. The second step of a player's turn is to add cards to the building piles in the middle of the playing area, if possible. As mentioned during setup, there will be space for up to 4 building piles to be placed in the middle of the playing area, next to the draw pile. At the beginning of the game, all of the piles will be empty. Players will start adding to these piles during step 2 of their turn. Before we move on, let's look at what buildings are. Buildings are runs of cards starting at 1 and ending at 12, in consecutive ascending order. There may be up to 4 building piles going at one time during the game. To start a new building, a player must play either a 1 or a Skip-Bo card. Skip-Bo cards are wild cards in the game, so they may be played as any number. To add to a building, a player must play the next card in ascending order, or a Skip-Bo card, which, once again, acts as a wild card. When the 12 card, or a Skip-Bo card played as a 12, is added to a building, that building is complete, and the pile will be discarded in a discard pile to the side of the draw pile, and a new building may be started in its place. All players in the game will be working to build onto the same 4 buildings in the middle of the playing area. Now that you have the basics of buildings down, let's move on. There are 3 places players can get cards to add to buildings. The first place a player can get cards from is their hand of cards. For example, this player could play their 4 from their hand onto this building, and their 11 from their hand onto this building. If you are able to place all 5 of your hand cards onto buildings during step 2 of your turn, immediately draw a new hand of 5 cards from the draw deck and continue playing. Another place from which a player can get cards to add to buildings is their stockpile in their playing area. You may play the top card of your stockpile onto any of the buildings in the middle, as long as the card is the next card in numerical order. Whenever you play the top card of your stockpile, replace the card by flipping over the next card in the pile. You can continue playing cards from the top of your stockpile as long as they have a place on one of the building piles in the middle. Players should always give a higher preference to playing cards from their stockpile, because to win the game, they must clear this entire pile. The final option is placing cards from one of your 4 discard piles in your player area. Discard piles will be explained further in the next step. Basically, a player may play a card from any one of their 4 possible discard piles by taking the card from the top of the pile and adding it to a building. They may not dig through the piles to get the card they may need. It must be on the top of one of the piles. During step 2 of a player's turn, they may play as many cards as they are able to, or wish to, from their hand, stockpile, and their discard piles, in any order they choose. On the other hand, if you are unable to, or choose not to add any cards to buildings from your hand cards, stockpile, or discard piles, you will simply skip step 2 and move on to step 3 of your turn. The final step of a player's turn is to discard one card from their hand of cards onto one of the discard piles. Each player in the game can have up to 4 discard piles, which will be placed in their player area, next to their stockpile. At the beginning of the game, players won't have any discard piles, so they will start a new one by placing a card face up. As the game moves on, they may either place the card on an empty space, if they don't already have 4 discard piles started, or add it to one of their existing discard piles in their player area. The discarded card does not have to be the next card in numerical order, so discard piles will simply be random piles of cards. If you discard your last hand card during step 3 of your turn, do not draw a new hand of cards. This will happen at the beginning of your next turn. As mentioned in step 2, a player may use cards from their discard pile to place onto buildings, so a player may strategically discard cards in order to play them later. It will be up to each player to decide their strategy for discard piles. To recap, on your turn, you will first draw cards from the draw pile in the middle of the playing area until you have 5 cards in your hand. Then you will add cards to buildings, if possible, from your hand cards, stockpile, or discard piles. If you play all of your cards from your hand while adding cards to the buildings, draw a new hand of 5 cards and keep playing if you can. After you have played as many cards as you can, or wish to, onto buildings, discard one of your hand cards onto one of your 4 discard piles in your player area. After taking your turn, the next player in clockwise order will take their turn and complete the 3 steps of their turn. The game ends when a player plays the last card from their stockpile onto one of the building piles in the middle of the playing area. That player is declared the winner. If you wish to play multiple games, you can keep score. The player who won the game will score 25 points. They will also score 5 points for each card left in their opponent's stockpiles. For example, if this was a 3-player game, and player 3 won the game, they would score 25 points for winning. Then they would collect all of the cards left in player 1 and player 2's stockpiles and score 5 points for each card. The first player to reach 500 points wins the game.